Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Are we ready to go? Everybody good with that? Awesome. So Sarah, let's welcome everyone. Sarah and I are co-hosting this talk today, Table Talk on greenwashing, and we have a guest co-host who we are excited to invite and have join us. Her name is Divya, and we're excited to bring her on. Not only will it allow us to have another perspective, it expands our network and it allows you guys to get another perspective. So Sarah.
Thank you guys, everyone. So thank everyone for joining us today. We have an amazing all-star panel to talk about greenwashing today. I mean, I'm assuming that everyone knows what greenwashing is, but I'm just going to read out the definition just so that so everyone knows what it is.
Wait, but then I want everyone to say, pick it apart and say what's wrong with it, why it's wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, so greenwashing, you know, is the process of conveying a false impression or providing misleading information about how a company's products are more environmentally sound, right? So that said, you know, there's so much talk about greenwashing right now because there really isn't a whole lot of systematization or analytics that is universal in terms of tracking people's brand sustainable practices. So there's a huge problem right now with, you know, are brands telling the truth? Are they lying? And how do you know the difference, right? So our amazing panelists today are all specialists in sustainability and supply chain and sourcing, and they're going to give us their insights and information about what they're doing in the industry and what they know, and they're going to help educate us on how to, you know, act sustainably and buy sustainable brands. So that being said, take it away, Divya Demato.
Yeah, but Divya.
Well, thank you so much, Justine and Sarah. It's such a pleasure and honor to get to know both of you, East Coast, West Coast representing, and just to be here today. I think this is such an important topic. I'm so glad that this is something that we're bringing to the forefront for all of our other guests today, right? Everyone who's joining this conversation. And I think it's gonna be really interesting to see how we've all interpreted the conversation, what brands are trying to do versus what they're actually doing, and how do we become better informed, I think, as consumers and as business leaders in our own communities. So I'm Divya Demato, CEO and co-founder of GoodOps. We are a sustainable supply chain company. We're here based in the Bay Area after about 8 years in New York. And we work with brands both in food and fashion to help them achieve their environmental and social goals very much through their supply chain, where we really believe that's where the biggest impact can be made. And we have a focus both on the environmental as well as the social side. And I'm so excited. We're not going to spend too much time on bios because we're going to jump right in. But we have PC Chandra and Fatima Anwar. I'll let them give their own intros, but super excited to have them here. And before I jump to that, I want to just give an example of a brand that I feel has actually done an exemplary job standing by their marketing claims. And it's actually one of our clients, and they're named Able. And they're based in Nashville, Tennessee. They're a US company, but their whole mission is to help women emerge out of poverty through work. And what they predominantly do is source only from women-owned factories or factories that are primarily working, you know, are worked by women. And their huge mission and why they actually hired GoodOps was to basically evaluate all the sustainability metrics out there and the different certifications and standards and find out which one really moves the dial on social impact on the human side, especially for women. And ultimately what we came up with is that the sort of the silver bullet, you know, in terms of helping women is really paying them a living wage. So, you know, super excited. That's their mission, their focus. They're working with their factories to actually do that. And I think it's a great example of a brand who's not greenwashing and is actually living up to their statements. So with that, I'll give it to Fatima and let herself introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you both, Justine, Divya, Sarah, for having me here today. My name is Fatima Anwar. I am the founder and CEO of Ethical and Sustainable Sourcing. We connect apparel brands, primarily in North America, with manufacturers that tend to be price competitive, sustainable, and ethical, mostly out of South Asia. I'm also the co-host of Straight from the Source. It's a podcast that focuses on really creating more transparency in the supply chain process, as well as really informing our listeners around what sustainability really is and how to move more towards that. And hopefully out of the conversation today, I can maybe leave you with some tidbits from my experience of not what just to look for, but what you can do on your steps towards becoming more sustainable, because the goal is not necessarily to shame, but to empower, in my opinion.
I second that. Anybody else? I think that's awesome. That statement. I really appreciate that.
And PC would love to have your intro as well.
Great. Hi everyone. My name is PC. I have over 10 years of experience working in digital innovation-based roles in the fashion industry and as a consultant. I've worked at brands like Nike, Macy's, Ralph Lauren, and Dion von Furstenberg. I'm passionate about sustainability and how do we apply it to these incumbent brands. On my side job, as I like to say, is I advise Alante Capital, which is a sustainability-oriented venture capital fund that only invests in socially and environmentally sustainable solutions in fashion and apparel. Eileen Fisher is both our chief advisor and our primary investor. And I also write a thought leadership series called An Insider's Guide to the Front Lines of Digital Fashion, where I cover a lot from my work behind the scenes in fashion in terms of where brands are in the product innovation curve and where brands are on that sustainability adoption curve.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. That's great. Such a great wealth of knowledge here and experience. I love the fact that we have so many different points of view and people with different things. So I know we're going to start here, and I'd love, I know that Sarah, did you want to just shoot off some of those questions that we had going?
All right, so we kind of touched on what greenwashing is and why it's important. So panelists and people out there, how can you spot greenwashing and a brand's marketing claim? What is a red flag that you see when you are on a site or in a store or you hear about a brand? What screams greenwashing to you?
Anyone?
I could take it.
Yeah.
I often say that greenwashing is, you know when a brand is greenwashing when they don't talk about numbers. So this is very much, sustainability in fashion is very much a measurable, it's very much a measurable thing. There are certifications and indexes out in our industry that are very clear about how much it takes, what is the environmental impact of certain material makes, what is the environmental impact or social impact of sourcing from certain countries. And these are not clandestine, hard indexes to understand. I always defer to the Caring Index, the EPNL index created by Caring. And basically what it does, it looks at carbon emission, water usage, pollution, chemical makeup, and it says by the country a certain material is sourced in, how many euros per kilogram was the impact on the environment. It's an open source platform. It was something Caring paid for and paid a lot of money for the research to do. And they open source it, so anyone can use it. So I always tell people, like, it's very important to understand the numbers. If we look at organic cotton, which is probably one of the more sustainable materials out there, you know that the impact of that is in the low 60s to 70 euros. If you look at polyurethane-based materials from China, it's in the 90 to 100. So when you look at products that are made of a material that is of a higher number, you just know that it's not a sustainable, it's not a sustainable product. So brands that aren't willing to publish an index or publish their progress against an index, that typically is a sign to me that they aren't sustainable. And it's just, you have to understand that certain products will just never be sustainable. And that's where these indexes are so helpful.
I think that's great. I think the other call out I'd make, because I believe that that's totally on point. If you don't have the data, there's conversations, or not even conversations, but labels like mostly recycling or mostly organic, and we don't have any of the details, you know, that's definitely a red flag. I think the other one is, you know, really defining what is sustainability. So, you know, when you have brands that are saying we donate to charities, or we do carbon offsets, for example, you know, to me, that's not really in the bread and butter and the DNA of the company. It's sort of, you know, you do sort of wrong here and then try to do right there. So I feel like that's another thing to really understand. What is the company or the brand doing themselves, whether it's food or fashion, and the manufacturing of their goods, and the people and the planet that it impacts. I also, in my personal opinion, I also feel the 1-for-1 or 1-to-1 model is also not really sustainable. You know, kind of the same idea of you're doing sort of something bad over here and then saying, well, later on we'll give to other communities over here. You know, it's really about, again, the how the products are being made and really getting behind that and understanding, you know, the water for the environmental side of things, you know, how much water is being used, what's the waste that's being created, you know, of course, what are the emissions as well. And from the human side of things, you know, what are the worker rights that are part of that production, both from the wages, benefits, and all the other, you know, aspects of sort of the labor rights movement.
So I also have a little bit of a point of view on this, especially given the fact that I work with so many manufacturers and certain brands that are actually being sustainable and not necessarily talking about it. So first, right, because we want to be better, it's difficult to talk about it because it's difficult to know how to label yourself as sustainable, because there is no possible way realistically from at least a medium to large scale production point of view to be fully sustainable. It's just not realistic, nor is it fully realistic to be able to really capture from a data point of view everything that you are doing, from tracking to your fabric to your carbon offsetting to your carbon footprint. So rather, I believe in a model where even if you want to eventually move to a sustainability index, even if you want to start tracking your data, the first thing that you can do is just be more transparent about what fabrics you are using. And I think that in itself will take us a long way. Because if you ask about, okay, what factories are you using, what products are you using, a lot of times that is confidential information that is part of your PI and something that gives you somewhat of a competitive advantage. So I do understand to an extent some brands not wanting to disclose who they work with, but disclosing what fabrics they work with and what certifications come with the fabrics is a big game changer. You can work with a lot of cotton. That does not necessarily mean that you're using organic cotton, goat's cotton, BCI cotton. Actually, I think the market penetration for, pardon me, BCI cotton is, I think, around 2 or 3%, and goats might be around the same. So when we look at it holistically, it's saying what materials are you using and what percentage of these materials are you using. And there's lots of ways to be transparent about that. You can post about it on your website. You can use the back of your product to print more information. There's lots of ways to be creative. We don't always have to get everything right, but I think in this more global, transparent world, consumers and even professionals such as ourselves would really appreciate the attempt to be more honest in a real dialogue.
Fatima, I think you hit it on the head. There's this phenomena with certain fashion brands where there's transparency without transparency,
exactly.
Right? So if someone is going to make a claim that they are sustainable, that they are a sustainable brand, I almost think they're working towards sustainability, because I think, Divya, you and Fatima both hit it on the head. A lot of people are afraid to talk about becoming more sustainable. Eileen Fisher always says the same way because she hadn't achieved it. But everyone's on this path, and it's better to just share where you are on that path. So I always check if there is a claim on a website or there is a claim through a marketing piece, is there a corresponding report? Because they have these websites, because investors are interested in this. Brands like Ralph Lauren have a very comprehensive plan over the next 5 years of what they want to do, and they say what the progress is against the plan. And I think, Divya, you hit on something that really it strikes a chord with me, because it really is how I started my work in sustainability. I was invited to talk to the first round of innovators that were sourced for the H&M Foundation's Global Change Awards. And what they basically did is they went out to the market, to universities, to other fashion brands, and they basically asked, what are the product innovation makes, either in fabrication or in manufacturing processes, that are more sustainable that H&M could potentially fund. What I realized in that experience, and H&M has come a long way, so I'm going to brace that. Like this was the first year of the awards almost a decade ago. No one from the actual main brand was at that award. No one was part of those conversations. So I was invited to coach them in terms of how do you pitch these materials and these manufacturing opportunities to their sourcing team, but no one from their team was there to ever really adopt it. So when you see such a clear delineation of sustainability as either a brand's mission, Divya, as you called out, or as a side foundation or a marketing-led CSR initiative, you should immediately have those red flags that this is not a sustainable brand, that what they're doing is using sustainability as a marketing ploy versus truly trying to make it part of their mission and their brand.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. So I spend so much time, researching brands and analyzing brands. And for those of you, I don't even think I said that I'm the founder of SPUNJ Sustainability, which is an online marketplace for sustainable brands. So I spend a lot of time doing this. And I feel like the quandary that I see with a lot of these big companies like an H&M or a Zara or a Uniqlo is they make a lot of claims about, I think they're on the right track for using sustainable materials, but I find they get a lot of poor grades for like empowerment or fair trade or the more social side of fashion. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about that in any way. I mean, I feel like there's always like a catch-22 with a lot of the brands that I come across. It's like they're either good on the fabric side and they're bad on the social side, or vice versa. You know what I mean?
I think Toby Usnick calls this the lesser evil phenomena in
Right?
sustainability. Yeah.
There's a few things that, I'll just sort of chime in here. I think typically sustainability has been the environmental side, and many times, at least from a lot of the work that we've done, is it's almost easier to measure in many ways. It's almost easier to even attain. So it tends to be also where brands tend to go when they're thinking about, where they want to play. And I think Fatima brought up a great point as well. It's also that it's hard to be 100%, right? So it also has to align with where the brand's values in sustainability, or what are they trying to achieve? And that's actually a good start. That's usually the first question you ask any brand, is that what are you trying to do in the conversation of sustainability, and then sort of aligning them to the resources and the opportunities to actually achieve that. But a great way is also then to introduce them into other ways of actually making impact. So, if they might begin with saying, well, our consumers or our board or us, me as a founder or CEO, really feel strongly in not wasting water and having clean water. And that's sort of just that their mission and vision. Great. So then how do we sort of use that as a wedge to come in? And I think, especially, if we bring it to modern day and the conversations that are happening right now, we're seeing a lot of chatter around the move towards the social side of things. I think COVID brought into everyone's sort of consciousness around, the human impact and a sort of a collective experience that we're all having. And we're starting to see that the social side is starting to come back and being sort of vogue. And I think that's great. I mean, that's something that we spend a lot of time on, because we do feel that that's an area that is not as, talked about. Mm-hmm. But one area that was previously talked about, and back in the day, was around modern day slavery, child labor. Those things did come out quite a bit, but they were so obviously wrong that I think people sort of rallied around that. But now I think that the conversation will be much more around wages and equity, and just the amount of hours it takes for a worker to work just to even make minimum wage, for their basic needs.
I think the tough part about that was that the definition of sustainability was so broad. When this all started 15 years ago, I think back to that first Olympics where, the 1996 Olympics, where Nike was called out for not being sustainable because their products had chemicals that were not approved for sale. And then they also had all these crises with their third-party suppliers where there were human rights violations. And like you said, people not being paid a living wage. And that kind of started that conversation. And it wasn't really only until a few years ago that the United Nations gave a definition of what sustainability was, with 18 goals. And we all started measuring against those 18 goals. And everybody knows this, 18 was too many, right? You can't have a target for all 18. I mean, you don't even have 18. It was hard to find 18 colors to make that wallpaper that we all use, right? So it was a very hard problem for people to wrap their head around these 18 goals. I actually, with a lot of fashion brands that I work with, when we start the conversation, sustainability, those 18 anchors are still important because it is environmental. You have to have that balance of environmental sustainability and social sustainability. But I really kind of break it out into four actionable parts of fashion brands. One is purely around fabrication and make. So is the make of your product from tier 5 to tier 1 manufacturers, from your raw materials all the way through retail, are you sustainable in that regard? And we all know from basically every index measuring that 80% of waste in the environment comes from that raw material and finished material tier 4 and 5 level. And I'm sure Fatima will take us down that line. The second is are your operations, to your brand, are those sustainable? So does that mean, does your office use sustainable energy? Are you making the most out of digital technology like 3D design to reduce oversampling, or virtual showrooms? Are you making the most out of that? The third bucket is, do you have business models that are in fact sustainable by nature? And I'm talking about the on-demand economy, the circular economy, and the shared economy, which by nature has eliminated the waste of overproduction and really has kind of like paid for the sustainability journeys of brands, because now the consumer is giving you credit actually with the business model for being more sustainable. And the fourth bucket are those social measures. And those social measures, some of them are like intrinsic to your brand and what your brand supports, right? Working at DVF, we were very much a brand that supported women empowerment. We were a brand that supported women leaders in the industry. So that was part of that was probably like the biggest weight of our sustainability, would be the biggest weight of our sustainability score. But those social impacts are just as important, especially now as we see so many of these suppliers are really kind of being punished for this pandemic, or being hurt because of this pandemic. Yeah, so 18 is too much. 16 and 18 is just too many goals. But if you think about it in those 4 buckets, as a fashion brand, you can create that balanced scorecard to say, okay, we could be C's across the board, or we may have 1 A and 3 C's, and this is where we can focus to get everything up to an A. So you don't have this lesser evil phenomena, Sarah, that you see.
I actually have a question, so if you don't mind. So
yeah.
I think, there are these challenges, but now we also have COVID. And I think, I'm curious, how did it look before COVID? How does it look now? And how is that going to impact the future, trying to maintain that sustainability and build a product that really is honest and transparent? Because there's a lot of new challenges.
I think you have 2, and I think Fatima can take this one to the finish line too. I think you have 2 things that are going to happen. You're going to have some fashion brands that take this inflection point because so much is changing, and they're going to rebuild their business models. They're going to rebuild how they make their product, how they support social, the social good, and how they support their business models. They're going to rebuild that to be more sustainable. And these are the brands that are going to be the next survivors. These are the Kerings, the LVMHs. They're already on that path. And then you're going to have the other people that can't afford to do it and are going to use this as a scapegoat to get out. And that's going to start at the manufacturing base. They're going to go back to all those bad manufacturing practices that we saw since the Bangladesh fire. And you're going to see the bifurcation of the brands. And I bet you the brands that take this opportunity to take a hard pivot and say, hard stop, everything's changing, let's do this the right way, those are the guys that are going to survive. And the guys that are going to continue to be bargain barrel, you know what? Consumers are going to see through that, and they're going to get fired. But Fatima, I think this is like up your alley.
Yeah, absolutely. So many thoughts. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and just use PC's framework just to sort of frame my answer and sort of condense both questions. One question is, what do we expect in a pre and post COVID world? What are the differences? And the other is really how do brands really prioritize? The way I look at it is I break brands up into 3 categories: small and startup, mid-sized brands, and large. I have significantly less patience for large brands who have the resources to make these excuses. I have a lot of sympathy. I want to really work with the mid-sized brands, because they're finally at a financial place where they can pivot and make decisions. And then there are your small brands who really have bare bones budgets. So if I'm talking to someone who's from a really small brand, a lot of times the way it works is that you're going to find one manufacturer, the manufacturer or their agent is going to work together to source the material, and they're going to get what they get. Now, with that being said, I still ask them, like, look, it's going to be maybe $1 or $2 more expensive per yard, but you can capture that cost because you're not going to start by being a small brand and trying to capture the mass market anyway. So you might have a little room to breathe. And so ask them, push them at least for the certificates if you can't go direct to the mill. The most important thing that you should be looking at is the factories themselves and the worker welfare. Start with that as your base of any kind of movement towards a better business practice, because otherwise this is a real human cost. And if we're not cognizant of that, then we're really helping perpetuate a system that's deeply faulty. Now, when we look at worker welfare, it's really important to understand it in the context of the production hub. So when we look at worker wage per day, it's really important not to look at it in the dollar sum value, instead to use a metric such as the purchasing power parity, which means for each dollar or each taka or each rupee that this worker makes, how many cans of Coke can they buy with their salary versus how many cans of Coke can they buy here? Because a simple exchange rate dilutes it. The US is a high value currency. And then you have to look at, all right, so if they're getting enough, that's great. Is it this factory that's problematic, or is it the entire landscape where workers are not getting paid appropriately? And this is one more factory that's following the trend versus a factory that's an outlier and not treating its workers well. That's when you have a fuller picture, at a certain point, you can start to do something about that. And by something, I don't mean the moment you reach scale to dump them and to go for a better manufacturer, but to really work and create a lot of long-term partnerships. Because I think on a manufacturing side, we're really hungry for these partnerships. We don't have the business sophistication, the kind of training, and these sort of conversations are not happening every day in every corridor. So bringing that information to us, helping us find a plan to move forward in a realistic way, does more towards helping empower workers and helping empower people than anything else. And then lastly, you know, the conversation around what's going to happen pre and post COVID. So one of the things that's been really alarming is the rate at which brands are not paying their bills. And there's a lot of outward denial of, no, we've paid it, or I don't know, the product was faulty, but also you can't sell it, and no, I won't give you a brand release letter. At least if they gave us a release letter, we could sell it as stock lot at a slightly lower value than the face value, but we don't have any of that. And now, having worked, because I am from Bangladesh originally, and I came here for college, and I worked in business strategy for many years, and I will tell you the importance of contract law in a situation like this. And we are not, again, that's where the savviness comes in. We are not savvy enough to ever have negotiated a good contract where we are protected in a situation like this. So again, this is not going to change until we all come to the table together and really try and understand one another, and not look down at each other and say, okay, you're not there, and in order to do better, I just need to leave you. It's a conversation, it's somewhat of a long haul, and contract law and some international adjudication needs to be in place for, I think, this process to even be fair. Now, pre-COVID, we saw a lot of movement towards sustainability, a lot of greenwashing, and then also some real effort to move towards sustainability. What I predict, it's gonna either go one or two ways. And the different consultant friends that I have, no one really has a very good idea of where we're going to land, because the economy could contract anywhere from 20 to 40% over the next 8 to 12 months. Now, that being said, with so many people out of work, I don't think it's fair to burden the consumer with saying, you know what, you need to go find a really great product and a sustainable product. There's going to be a large majority who want a more price competitive product. So my goal is to work with larger companies, larger brands, and help them tweak one or two things in the behemoth that is their supply chain to create some real impact. But we will see a large movement towards discount and discount retailers such as Marshalls, Ross, and others. And then for those who are in a good position, they are going to be much more conscientious. I really truly believe that those who can afford it will try and buy the North Face jacket or the Patagonia jacket versus something that's really, you know, it's shoddy workmanship, or even if it's good workmanship, which is just made terribly. And there's just too much awareness for that. But we also have to live in the reality of the economy that we are in right now, and people are suffering. So in the larger context of putting food on your table versus sustainability, I can understand consumers choosing otherwise. It's our responsibility as community leaders, as people in this business, to try and advocate as loudly as possible and make it as easy as possible for business leaders to make these sort of decisions. So
Fatima, I think you highlight something so important, which is just how hard these decisions are. And I think your whole segmentation of the brand base, where you have direct to consumer and startups, and you have medium brands and large size brands, is really important to understand. Fashion brands, if you're not making $250 million in revenue, you're not breaking even. There is no operational model out there that would say you as a brand are breaking even, because that's that tipping point. Typically, you see even those single category direct to consumer brands. That's a tipping point where they invest in their they go to venture capital. They take the loss every year. They ask their angel investors for additional money because you need to get over that $250 million hump.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I think people also don't understand is, this is not like healthcare or pharmaceutical where we have these big billion-dollar brands. In fact, the $15 billion mark is kind of like the big moment where you can hire expensive consultants and you can hire a strategist. You have a dedicated strategy team and all that stuff. And globally, there's only 6 apparel-based retailers that are above that $15 billion in revenue. So we're talking about like who can really make the change, who can do it quickly. And this is why those decisions are so hard, because even the most well-intended brands who want to be on the sustainability journey and should be on that sustainability journey, they also need to keep the lights open. And when some of these investments are not the most cost effective, or they are margin eroding, you can see why some of these brands had to step off the train.
Hey guys, it's Rachel here. Oh, sorry, did I interrupt you, Sarah?
No. I'll ask after. Go ahead.
Yeah, just fielding some comments from Facebook here. Just want to make sure we touch on some of these topics. This is one that's good. I see how food restaurants that are like high-end Michelin-starred restaurants pivoted during COVID to making foie gras and high-end sushi to making burgers and fries, just to appeal to the masses who have lost their jobs. Has there been something in fashion that is sustainable, that has pivoted to help those people, like you said, that were losing their jobs or making much less money? I mean, they must be having to pivot just making some sort of income.
Making
masks. I see that in new show. Yes, making masks. That's a great one. I've seen some places make masks that are still like $30 because they're branded. But yeah,
I really appreciate those brands that have been taking the material liability stuff that they've had on hand and made masks out of them, because we both know like those liability materials, we all know those liability materials could have sat on that shelf for a very long time, or they would have been destroyed, right? Because a lot of them are IP based. So I was actually really impressed with the brands that did that so quickly. I also think that some of the beauty brands or some of the bigger fashion houses pivoting to creating not only PPE, but hand sanitizer, that was actually really cool. That was a really cool way to respond to demand. Estee Lauder transitioned their North America-based factories to do that. So I think those are like some things that are like the good. But I mean, if we're going to talk about how they're trying to service the consumer that has no money now, this is a price sale out there in fashion. You can get basically any product you want now at cost. I'm seeing 80% sample sales from fashion brands because there's just too much inventory. The off-price players can't take any more of the jobbed inventory. There's just a huge excess. Everyone needs cash, right, Fatima? People need to pay their suppliers. You've heard about merchant factories.
I need you to drop the link of the sample sale.
Go to basically anyone except for an LVMH or a Kering-based brand, because they are so much better at inventory management at those two fashion houses. But go to any contemporary-based brand, and you're going to see fire sales right now, because they can't give it away anymore. And the longer they sit on it, the worse their books look. And they need the cash. They need the cash to pay the suppliers, lest they accrue these huge interest payments, less there's huge legal settlements that are happening. A lot of fashion brands rely on what they call a merchant factor. And what a merchant factor does is it's an accounts receivable, where when a product hits a factory, that merchant factor takes possession of the inventory. And then when a product hits a warehouse, that is the warehouse for a fashion brand, that merchant factor takes possession of the inventory. And then when it leaves the warehouse, either for a direct-to-consumer sale or it leaves as a bulk order to a wholesale account, all of that inventory then gets turned into cash, and the fashion brand gets that cash right away, whether or not Saks Fifth Avenue paid their purchase order or whether or not that consumer's credit card is cleared. The issue with that is all these merchant factors are now defaulting. So not only do fashion brands not have that cushion of consistent sales, they're not able to maintain these merchant factors either. You can read about that publicly in the news. I think JCPenney is the one that had the biggest headline, but they weren't the only ones. And that's a public filing, right? Because it's a credit account. So if you want to see who's going to be liquidating and burning through their inventory quickly, just do a Google search for merchant factors. That's not really a sustainability or greenwashing conversation, but I'm all about the deal.
I think but just to even add to that, I think we're going to see a lot of innovation as well come up. I mean, last time we had, I was big in the flash sale space. You know, back in the day, I was at One Kings Lane. It was the rise of, I was also at Vente Privée. There was Guild Group, and it was also because of the last, you know, Great Recession, where there was so much excess inventory, and this was a time when it wasn't just-in-time inventory, and it was a lot of holding inventory, and so there was innovation that sort of sprung up to kind of deal with some of the economical issues that have, you know, economy issues that have happened. And I think also as a pre-COVID sort of trend, you know, with ThredUp and with The Real, and, you know, again, with looking at other channels and other ways to sort of move through some of this inventory, we're only going to see a rise of that. I think it's going to be kind of an interesting time because we know the consumer is, especially the Gen Z consumer wants that, right? I think it's going to be interesting for brands who are making product from scratch. And it's going to be an interesting sort of not using dead stock or not using sort of existing sort of innovations. It's going to be really interesting to see, you know, what the consumer appetite's going to be when they sort of see waste in the model of the brands. And I think that's going to be a big trend as well. It's just, you know, I think, you know, PC, you mentioned some of those things around like design concepts, you know, 3D printing, how do you reduce waste on the sort of the design sort of process, right? So I think you find less of just sort of the hamburger French fry model, but more of a sort of, you know, it has to be authentic, and it has to feel, some of the research we're doing is it has to feel that it's not going to harm the world. The Gen Z consumer has been hit, you know, left and right and ongoing with so many kind of just disasters. And I think that there is a fear in terms of, you know, what is the world going to hit them with next? And so I think any brand that's not thinking about this and talking about it, it's going to have a big, you know, a big backlash.
I think that's where you go back to that 4-factor scorecard, right? There's a bunch of things that we're going to see in terms of innovation with the consumer. I think we're going to see the rise of the on-demand economy. You're going to see people that are going to pay personalized products for a premium because they can still spend that money, and that's better for a brand. We already hear that the circular economy continues to outpace the growth of the traditional economy. The traditional brand to retail the traditional brand to consumer economies was only slated to grow 1% to 2% before COVID. Who knows if there isn't even going to be growth, right? But we're still seeing in that circular space a 30 to 40% increase year over year. So I think you're right about the business models. Like you said, there's innovation there, but even when it comes to operations now within a fashion brand, there's now a justification to become leaner and invest in those digital technologies. When I was at Ralph Lauren, I helped create the prototype of their first digital showroom. And what the vision of this thing was going to do, it was going to take 3D-based CAD, so we wouldn't have to get all these sell-in samples for wholesale. 3D-based CAD, so you can see the whole assortment. We were going to use artificial intelligence in order to target the line recommendations to the different accounts we were going to go to. And we were going to use augmented reality to bring it to life, the world of what we call the world of Ralph Lauren, the marketing stories, the things that you would see when you come to the showroom in New York that you couldn't see when you have to do this virtually. And we decided to start in golf. And the reason why we decided to start in golf was our golf business was, you know, kind of as Fatima described, it was like operating a small brand because we had some big department store accounts which would come to New York and we would do the whole spiel. But then we had to put salespeople on the road to sell to these mom and pop led country clubs, right? And that was expensive because they were lugging around suitcases of samples. They were lugging around all this customized product because in country clubs, the polo horse has less resonance than the logo of the country club, right? So you have to do all of this stuff and all of this waste just to sell in a product. So that being said, it was a successful pilot. And I know Ralph Lauren cited it in the news recently that that's where they're going to be taking the business now. So, you know, you have these digital innovation companies like Jewel who can do it already. You have the people at Li & Fung have created a digital showroom for Tommy Hilfiger. But that's really where it's going. We're going to see, I hope that's where it's going. We're going to see this reduced dependency on creating these samples of products, you know, 80% of which were never adopted or never actually manufactured and go for sale. right? And you did all this work, you cut all this fabric, and then you throw it all away, or you sell it at a sample sale. That model doesn't work anymore, right? So this is that impetus for that virtualization of product creation that I think will make fashion brands more sustainable.
So, oh, sorry, Fatima.
Oh, I was just going to add a little bit to what PC and Divya just said, because from our end, right, when you are talking about manufacturing hubs, the real question is the scalability of that technology. And that's really the scalability and cost of that technology. And so some of the technology pieces that PC was talking about is really adoptable, because all you need is a good Wi-Fi connection, and you need to just download the apps and have 3D cameras and things of that nature. We'll still always have fit samples, but we won't have 10,000 variations of the fit samples that we now need to send to your showroom. That's where we're going to cut down on, you know, just our footprint, our time, because underpinning everything is efficiency. If somehow the product that you are creating is either creating revenue for me or is creating efficiency for me, it's going to scale. Otherwise, it's going to be a really, really cool, wonderful idea, but where are we going to see it scale? And, you know, with on-demand manufacturing, for instance, there are some issues with that, right? And that still is for generally smaller brands, where they can just either accumulate a ton of orders, send it per batch, and then have the orders come and distribute it. So there's this lag time. And as much as consumers are appreciative of that, unless it's a product that they really, really want, a lot of times you're going to see a drop off, and they won't be reordering. So a lot of these brands live and die by that a little bit too. So I don't think from a realistic business processes point of view, the old model is going away anytime soon. And I think in order for the old model to be better, because there's not everything about it is wrong, right? Like not everything about it is broken. What can we do in the old model? Where can we inject some accelerant where we have more transparency, where we have more efficiency, and therefore we're going to get either more sustainability, better business results, and a lower cost?
I think this is where, when it comes to the idea of greenwashing, this is where you always have to, and sustainability in general, you always have to start with the consumer, right? The adoption of these sustainable practices in fashion came out of the fact that these new business models, the on-demand economy, the circular economy, the shared economy, became wanted by the consumer. They were a consistent revenue stream. Whether they're profitable or not, again, depends on the scale, right? But the consumer has demanded it. I think there's an analogy to that when it comes to greenwashing. And Sarah, I know I've spoken with you about this at a higher level, but it's the idea of a single certification. One of the things that, you know, the G7 Fashion Coalition has spoken about openly is the idea of, we're going to come to a single certification. We just don't know what it is yet. But I think it's going to be just like the restaurant industry. You know, Justine, it's just like the restaurant industry. When a consumer goes to a restaurant and they see that there's a B in the window because of the health board certification, you kind of decide whether or not you're going to take a risk on that B, if like the food in it is really worth it, or you cross the street to an A restaurant, right? Imagine if fashion brands have this consistent index, which, you know, a consistent index which they're measured against. Then you have this A, B, C score associated with you as a brand that is unimpeachable. Because right now there's too many of those definitions, there's too many of those indexes. But at that point, the consumer is going, you know, at that point, the consumer by nature is going to say, do I really want something from the B score if the A score is just as good? And then that creates the business to business opportunity, or the business impetus to do the more expensive transformations that are required, Fatima, with our supplier partners, right? Because now brands will want to achieve a better score because it's a public facing thing and they're getting measured against their peers. So the things that suppliers are already doing really well, like 3D design, you know, suppliers are doing really well with that. Certain automation of certain processes like cutting, they're the ones making those investments in those expensive machines, not the fashion brands. All of that stuff is going to become more, the journey of adoption is going to be more accelerated. The journey of innovation is going to be more accelerated if we can get the consumer to land, if we can get that consumer to land on that single certification and see that change in behaviors.
Sarah, you wanted to say something?
This goes back to like what we've been talking about for the past, like, I don't know, half an hour, but I see this huge constriction happening. I mean, it goes back to everything we're talking about, right? This huge constriction in the industry, you know, from small brands barely being able to like stay in business because of COVID, and they're having like GoFundMe campaigns, large brands, you know, going bankrupt. and not being able to pay suppliers. On top of that, you know, brands like Gucci and then Dries Van Noten wrote that open letter calling for smaller production. So I just feel like how, you know, all these forces constricting at the same time, and if, you know, the brands that are, you know, big and surviving and profitable are cutting back on production, how is that going to affect, you know, like factories and manufacturers, and is it going to have an effect, and what's it going to do to the industry as a whole? I would love to hear what you guys think about that, what your perspective is.
Should I take that one?
That one has your name on it.
To tell you really quickly, we're going through an incredible amount of pain right now. Not everyone is going to come out of it alive. And what you do in a time like this is that you pivot. And a lot of the manufacturers that I work with, because they're tier 1 to tier 3, maybe tier 4, they're able to maybe pivot to PPEs, but they don't have all of the sales pipelines open to them because testing through SGS is really expensive. They need to get an FDA approval. They need to get a CE sort of declaration of conformity. So what's going to happen is that you're going to see certain industries like manufacturing, especially in countries like Bangladesh, deeply affected. The good news for a specific country like Bangladesh is that before this, we were moving towards a middle income economy. Essentially, so we're diversified enough, but there really isn't a lot of resources beyond charity to help a lot of these garment workers. And so I would encourage folks to look up some of these different GoFundMe accounts and different charities that are supporting workers, because we will stabilize and normalize at a certain time. And that's going to be the opportunity. It's going to be a market grab for either US textiles or a lot of other countries to come and try and grab a piece of that manufacturing pie, but it's never going to be exactly the same again. And Bangladesh is a big loser in that, because we're 30 years in deep. This was our biggest export driver. And we are going to, unfortunately, just have to find a way to ride it out, but it's already caused a lot of hardship and a lot of poverty. And the government's actually done a really good job stepping in and subsidizing some of these salaries. So
I don't think people understand, because not everyone has your firsthand knowledge, Fatima, of being at a supplier site. This is not like in the United States where, you know, these factories like in Detroit, or even like what Tracy Reese is doing by trying to stand up a new onshore apparel manufacturing factory here in the United States. It's not like where they come and clock out and they go home and they get breaks every 15 minutes, right? There's a great documentary called The American Factory, which I think it won the Oscar this year. It's on Netflix, and the Obamas actually paid for the distribution. But it's a great, if you haven't been to supplier site in Bangladesh and China, or one of these countries where we really take advantage of the lower wage rates, these are mini cities. These suppliers provide housing, they provide infrastructure, schooling for the people that work at the, you know, for the families of the people that work at those factories. But the issue is that they have 24-hour work shifts. They don't have weekends. They don't have the same break structures that we do. And then when you lose your job, you lose your home. You lose you lose your infrastructure of your livelihood. So the fact that they're going to be cutting down on staff, the fact that they're going to, you know, because there's not going to be as much capacity needs, you know, and the timing and the reason, you know, with so much sickness in these high density housing, you're looking at a next humanitarian crisis there if we don't pay our bills, and if we don't, and because we have to do incrementally more to make sure that that society doesn't break down.
All right, let's get some questions.
And the other thing I want to just say is, I know we didn't get to talk about food at all and the impact of food in sustainability and building out some of these brands. And, you know, perhaps that's for another conversation, or if you have specific questions about that, because I know we do have some people here from NextGenChef, and we want to make sure that everyone feels included in the conversation. So is there anybody there that wants to just join in and share some questions?
There's some questions maybe in the chat for the Zoom, but I'm not
sure. Do you want to go through them and see, or mine's not working? It's not allowing me to scroll up.
Let's ask Rachel.
Rachel, can you go through the questions a little bit?
Yeah, I'm combing through. We have a lot of things open on Facebook, so it's a lot of rooms for me to go through.
Okay, I have something from Anusha. Packaging that reads organic or sustainable, but using plastic and unnecessary levels of packaging, red flags for me at the grocery store. Absolutely. That's something that transcends fashion and food. Packaging is a huge issue that we didn't even talk about today. Because if you're making a sustainable product and you're putting it in plastic and mailing it in bubble wrap and then putting it in a box and shipping it across the world, it doesn't really count as sustainable, right? And that applies
my
for food as
gosh.
well.
And I also feel
Yeah.
like a lot of the stuff that we started to do when COVID hit, when we go shopping, it's actually we're not finding sustainable solutions for it. We're bringing so many more bags with us. We're getting a lot more plastic. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but I'm challenged every day.
Yeah, I think that a challenge, and this is something we're also seeing, again, it's innovation, right? So there's a huge, as you're seeing all these big funds coming up around, addressing climate change and addressing some environmental issues, is we need more entrepreneurs, we need more innovation, and we need to also fuel the ones that are actually doing a lot of these solutions. Because I've been in supply chain, 16, 17 years now, and I've been to the warehouses and I've done the drop testing in warehouses. And sometimes even if you want to use the environmentally responsible packaging, things break.
Yeah.
So it's also around, the whole, if you look at the whole sort of system and then figuring out, how do you also have these partnerships? I think startups and large corporations, whether it's food or fashion, need to also work with different, entrepreneurs and innovations to also come up with these solutions and then start to actually scale them. And Peel is a great example, right? I mean, Peel is a great company in the food sector that has that coating on the food to help it, last longer, right? It's not necessarily packaging, but it's also just the sort of the life, the lifetime of that particular product is now extended, right? So how do you innovate? I think is really a big piece of, I think, finding these solutions, because brands are looking for them, but they have to also be really apples to apples. It can't be 10x the cost as well. Yes. So it's really, I think, a combination of that.
Just ask your consumer. I feel like we sometimes forget about that. At Ralph Lauren, there's an option that you can say, I want the eco-friendly packaging, which basically means it doesn't come in the full bleed box with 7 layers of tissue paper and plastic. And, I know for some people, the luxury shopping experience requires that. And that's great. But offer it to opt into it, right? Because, even as a consumer, for me, I'm like, shoot, every time I got one of those boxes in the old days, I was lugging all this stuff straight, down a 3-story walk up to throw it away. And now they have this option. It's just like, no, it'll just come, in a box. I'm like, that's great. I just ordered, a couple mitts. I didn't order a prom dress. Right?
I mean, food also has the added problem of water leakage, right? It's like clothing, it's dry. It's a dry material. So you can, put it in some sort of like a bio or water-based plastic, and ship it anywhere. But food is really tricky, right? Because there's the leakage problem. It's got to be waterproof. So, and I don't know. I mean, besides, do they have food packaging? Is it Peel food packaging?
No, it's a coating that they actually put on produce, for example, to help it actually stay longer without rotting. And it's been around for a while, and it's just now really picking up steam. But I think, local too, right? Like if you go local, you also reduce the amount of transit time, right? From a transportation logistics perspective. So I think food is doing a lot of innovation. You have these local delivery, whether it's Fresh Direct or, we're right now during COVID, we have local farms delivering to where we are. You have Imperfect Foods, obviously, that's doing incredible work as well. So I think when you're also connecting local communities, you're also limiting, I think, the waste with the packaging and some of the things I think that you're talking about, Sarah, as well. So I think it's really around connecting communities. Big thing I think COVID also brought up is around the localization first. I think fashion's also going to start to actually experience that as well. Yeah. The conversations is, what can you do that's close to you? And also it's a chance for brands to even know what's happening with their manufacturing. What are the local laws? What are the sort of challenges that those sort of individuals in the warehouses are facing versus sort of in some other country far away that, it's sort of like they kind of keep their hands clean of it, which are definitely not clean, but yeah.
Divya, I think you hit it on the head. Like innovation comes out of crisis, right? Like that's when the spirit of innovation happens. But the consumer has to give you credit for that innovation. Yeah. And I think like the food industry is one of the examples where that happens so much just because it's a commodity and consumable good. I know that the founder of Amy Organics works with Jennifer Garner's brand now, but he talks very openly about the fact that he created this whole new category of the organic cheese powder that they use in his macaroni and cheese, right? And it became this huge thing, organic macaroni, box macaroni and cheese, to the fact that craft foods had to respond and come up with its own formulation. So when you start seeing, when your consumer, and I think in food, it's more so than any other industry, when your consumer starts voting for another brand who's doing it for that innovation, you're going to see mass adoption amongst its competitors.
Absolutely. Yeah, big
And
brands.
a lot of that is supplier led, right, Fatima? A lot of those like material innovations, packaging innovations come out of the suppliers because they see it every day. It's not sitting in, it's not something conceptually on a computer for them. It's something that's on a shelf.
Yeah, and you know, through my line of work, I've actually connected with a couple of really fantastic sustainable packaging companies, and they're creating they're especially for takeaway food wastage, and they're targeting college communities. So we're moving away from the plastic and styrofoam to a more biodegradable form of food packaging, and they're using this wood pulp based this fiber to formulate their packaging. And they're doing it really well because they're going to harvestable wood sources and like, you know, growths where, you know, they're using bamboo and a couple of other sources. But again, everything has a trade-off, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And part of that is to also understand if we really have to stick with the plastics model, what does that really mean also for deforestation as well? Because that's also one of the areas where that's going to be a primary source of raw materials. However, I think, and this is just me, you know, wherever we can, if we can move to glass, that would be great. It's just hard for the stuff on the shelves, but I think it's not something that's out of the realm of possibility. Back in the day, all Coke products used to come in a glass bottle. We moved to plastic because it's easier and cheaper. We don't have to pay $1 for a Coke. We can afford to pay $2. And that's the thing we also have to keep in mind. Food, even the luxury food products, there's a little more margin if you can show the value. So I think there's a lot of ways to experiment with that and maybe, you know, go with an out-of-box material and out-of-box idea. That, you know,
hits so much. You hit so much on something that's so important, which is that idea of balancing the margin and balancing doing something good. I think that's why brands like Keurig have been able to accelerate their sustainability journeys. Not only do they have this EP&L, which is measurable, but Laurent Clocken, who is the president of North America for Keurig, each of his executives are also, they have the general gross margin based bonus that every merchant in fashion has, but they have a bonus. 10% of their bonus is associated with meeting their EP&L target. So when you have that incentive, a dollar incentive to do better, not only are you going to make your margin financially, his company has proven that. I mean, Gucci has been one of the most recession-proof brands out there, but you also have that incentive to make the decisions good, because good for society, good for the environment, because that's also money in your pocket, right? And it really does take a brand being able to factor those two sides of the decision-making equation in for us to see glass Coke bottles back on the shelf.
Great. Well, this was amazing. We're hitting the hour. We're just actually over, but my God, we could go for another, I don't know, 2-3 hours just on this topic alone. So this was such a pleasure. Thank you all so much. I'll let Sarah and Justine, you know, wrap us up, but PC, Fatima, thank you so much. This was awesome. Let's do it again soon. Sarah and Justine, let us know round 2.
If you check out NextGenChef, you'll see we keep all the events listed on the app. My little commercial, download the app, get lots of extra access to all the events. But if there's something that we're not doing that you want to see, send us a note, email us, find us on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever. We're happy to create new talks and events that really are tailored to what's interesting to everyone else. But I want to thank Divya for co-hosting this with us, and PC and Fatima for joining us. It was a really great conversation.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Such a pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening and participating.